Okay, welcome back to PHIL-1006, The Great Philosophers, Summer 2020 at Fanshawe College. This week we're going to be talking about Hobbes and Locke, two social contract theorists of the Age of Enlightenment, and moving on to Spinoza. First, though, let me draw your attention to a very important thing. Online quiz number 2 is going to be closing this weekend. I just extended the deadline to Sunday night. As you can see, I got 19 completed quizzes. I want to see it go up to, 42 is the amount of people that did it for quiz 1. So hopefully half the class didn't drop. Oh my gosh. So complete that quiz. Keep working on your essays as well. I'm really looking forward to reading them. Don't worry too much about, you might be stressed about writing it, making sure it's good. Don't stress. The best way to have good writing is to have any writing at all and then revising it. So just bang something out, bang a draft out, give it a day and look at it the next day. Give it a quick redraft and you'll be fine. This is a 1000 level Gen Ed class. As long as you submit work that isn't plagiarized, you're probably going to be fine. I shouldn't say that out loud. Okay, let's move on to Hobbes, Locke, and Spinoza, which is the content for this week's module. I said Hobbes and Locke were something called social contract theorists. This is a really interesting set of ideas that have to do with a reformulation, much as Descartes was attempting to do, a reformulation of political philosophy and philosophy in general in the context of an increasingly secular age. So, Thomas Hobbes, 1588, 1679, John Locke, 1632, 1704. All right, so that's a time period we're looking at. Both are really kind of concerned with creating a secular foundation for nation-state, for the idea of the nation-state, a secular foundation for government. The divine right of kings tied government and religion really intimately together. And for Hobbes and for Locke, this led to really disastrous warfare. It led to an encroachment of proper human freedoms and natural rights. Right? So it was not compatible with Enlightenment ideals of individual rights. And finally, it also just didn't make a lot of logical sense, especially for Locke, who wrote famously the two treatises of government. People forget this, but in the two treaties, basically the whole first treatise is why the divine rights of kings is a bad idea. And the second treatise is here's what we should do instead. Separation of powers, the legislative branch, judicial, executive, all these ideas we're very familiar with now. That's the second treatise. The first treatise is here's why the divine right of kings is a bad idea. The idea seems quaint to us now, the year's 2020, but of course, in this time period here, you had to argue against the dominant view at the time. And the new basis for government, the secular basis for government, was the idea for these two thinkers was the social contract. Citizens agree to be governed because it is in their interests, and government derives its legitimacy from this kind of mandate from the community that it serves, right? Because of everyone in it agrees to be part of this thing. So Hobbes and Locke have kind of different views of the social contract. So let's start with Thomas Hobbes. I think I have my copy of two treatises back here, but I won't be reading from it, don't worry. So Hobbes and Locke have really two different approaches to the idea of the social contract. If they were more similar, I might just do one or the other, but I'm going to do both here because they have pretty different views. So Hobbes comes to the conclusion that you need a really strong government. You need a government with absolute authority, wielding absolute power. Because without it, society would break down into chaos. Why? Because people are more individualistic than social. They are more selfish than selfless. So you could just think of it as Hobbes being in part really a pessimist about human nature. Locke, more of an optimist. People generally get along. Of course, it's in everyone's interest to collaborate on common projects that you can't complete alone, and coordination of these projects, like building roads or enforcing contracts, business contracts, requires something more than an individual who can't build a road by himself, who can't enforce contracts by creating a whole law system and enforcement of these laws, right? You need something like a government. These governments have limited powers and are under democratic control, right? So Locke and Hobbes, very different approaches here. So Hobbes wrote the Leviathan in 1651. Locke's two treatises of government about 40 years later, 1689. Locke obviously had an eye on Hobbes. And they were similar in some respects. They were both empiricists, unlike the rationalistic Descartes. Both were social contract theorists, and both made claims about something called the state of nature to defend their political philosophy and argue for the social contract. So here's a front piece for Leviathan. One of the details here, if you look at the cover art for the Leviathan, is pretty famous because the king here, the king's body, if you look closely, you'll see it's actually made out of people, the common mass of people who come together to in the social contract to form the sovereign. Leviathan, or the Matter, Form, and Power of a Commonwealth, Ecclesiastical and Civil, by Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury. So, just to give you some context, right? The Civil War, the English Civil War ended in 1651, and it was a pretty topical thing to be writing about how government should be formed, because the English Civil War revolves a dispute between Parliament and royalists over proper governance. Casualties were really high. In Ireland, for example, maybe 40% of the population died in the war from disease, from famine, from battles. The compromise was to create this parliamentary monarchy in 1660. So arguments about what kind of government we should have were really part of what was happening in the 17th century here, in a way that we don't really have. We just kind of assume democracy, representative, indirect democracy is just the way to go. In fact, we don't have any other forms of government on the table, except maybe like a authoritarian populism or something like a Russian or Brazilian model. So if you're writing about politics in the 17th century, you have a non-zero chance of like seeing your ideas actually put into practice, which is something we can't say for 2020. Knock on wood. So how did Hobbes reformulate government for a secular age? So everybody's going to reject the idea that the legitimacy of the government rests on the legitimacy of the religion. Either the papacy in Rome, right, telling the king, right, I anoint you to be ruler, or just like a divine lineage. Locke spends some time arguing against the view that the king is king because of a direct descent of rule from biblical times. So these things aren't believable anymore. So how do you justify government? So both Locke and Hobbes argue from something called the state of nature. Obviously, this was a little more than a little bit influenced by Western European colonialism, in the sense that both Locke and Hobbes were obviously aware of the recent discovery from the European perspective, so I'm putting discovery in scare quotes, of the North American continent, and that their perception of the peoples that lived there was that they existed kind of as a more in nature, less of an organized society. All these things aren't really true at all, but it played on their imaginations to imagine humans in a state of nature, people without organized society or government, just kind of living. And for Hobbes, the state of nature was not a good place to be in. Of course, I don't think any humans have ever lived in a literal state of nature. Wherever there are humans, there's human society, there's forms of governance, there's organization. So in fact, I really don't like the idea of the state of nature, because it plays into all kinds of tropes, both good and bad, about indigenous peoples and what tribal life is actually like. But I'm just going to close that parenthesis because we're dealing with European thinkers with a certain point of view that we should be critical of course. Um, but as we criticize, we also take out the interesting ideas here. So for Hobbes, the state of nature, that is the state prior to organized society, is quite awful. For Hobbes, without a ruler in the state of nature, humans exist in a state of continual warfare, a battle of all against all, where there's continual fear, danger of violent death, where the life of a person is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Um, so for Hobbes, the state of nature was literally the state of nature, in the sense that without society, without governance, without authority, we human beings find themselves no different from animals. In fact, this is kind of part of Hobbes's viewpoint here, which is that he's going to have a secular view of governance. And he's going to take that very literally, in the sense that he is not going to ground his politics on anything supernatural, anything divine, anything religious, not even any view of morality as objectively existing in a Platonic sense, because all that stuff is too abstract for him. He wants to ground it in a very basic, realistic thing, which is that it's in everyone's interest to want to live in a state where you are not in continual fear. Without some kind of authority, Hobbes claims, there's going to be nothing to prevent crime, nothing to prevent evil, nothing to prevent immorality. You won't be able to sleep at night without worrying you'll be murdered and have your belongings taken from you. All right? There has to be authority to prevent the state of nature, because the state of nature should be understood pretty literally for Hobbes. It's the condition the animals are in the state of nature. Right? Animals don't have morality of ethics. Animals have a right to everything at all times. Right? They fight and kill each other over resources, over food, over offspring. There's also cooperation in nature. Right? But this cooperation is no more moral than hunting is immoral. Every creature has a natural right to every other creature, to every other plant, to everything that it comes across. Right? So, I mean, there in the sense that if the gazelle who is hunted by a lion and killed, the gazelle can go, I can't believe you're doing this, lion. It's so wrong. In the state of nature, there's no such thing as right or wrong. And for Hobbes, the idea of the social contract is really to invent the idea of morality, where in the state of nature there is none. So it's not that there's an objective morality that exists independently of us. It's not that religion can ground morality. It's not that there is a God and God is good and this goodness tells us what to do. None of that is the case, which again, if you put it in the context of the 17th century, is a very radical thing to say. That in fact, there really is no such thing as morality. We live in a state of nature. We're no different than animals, except in one small thing. We are more rational than other animals, and our reason tells us that the state of nature can be escaped and should be escaped. It's not good to be good. It's in our self-interest to invent goodness. It is in our self-interest to agree to the social contract, to submit to the rule of law, to submit to any authority capable of enforcing the rule of law, so that we are not finding ourselves in a state akin to wild animals here. Right? Because if this was society, there'd be no place for industry. There'd be no culture of the earth. As I said, fear, violent death, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short life. Right? Because the state of nature is one without morality, so we invent morality via the social contract. This philosophy is useful in a way because you can have, I mean, from a certain point of view, right, even if you don't believe in morality, even if you think that morality is a human invention, you're a nihilist or something, Hobbes is still there going, well, you probably don't want to live like this. You probably want to invent morality, just kind of have the handshake deal and say, how about we don't murder each other in our sleep for our stuff? And if we all agree to this and to someone who can enforce it, then morality exists. It exists the way all kinds of social constructs exist. Like money's a social construct, but we still use it. but a piece of paper is valueless, right? So morality is a social construct we invent because we are rational and we want to escape the state of nature. If animals could kind of agree on a deal like this, they probably would be better off, right? The gazelles would be like, okay, you can have these ones here, just don't hunt the rest, right? You could figure out some kind of arrangement, but they're unable to. Humans are able to figure out an arrangement by which, right, morality is invented and respected. So as Hobbes says in Leviathan, it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, right, that they fear the power and they won't act badly. They're in that condition which is called war. Such a war as is of every man against every other man. So the state of nature is really brutal, and the social contract, Hobbes says, doesn't justify a democracy, right? Because in a democracy, rulers can be overthrown, they can be changed. What we need is a sovereign who cannot break the law or be deposed kind of by definition. For Hobbes, it's always immoral to revolt because it is the sovereign that creates morality. For example, private property doesn't exist prior to the social contract, right? It's the sovereign that creates the idea of private property. For some libertarian philosophers, they think private property is just kind of a natural basic right that exists whether or not there's a government. For a guy like Hobbes, he's going to say, no, you need government to invent and enforce the very idea of private property. There's interesting debates in political philosophy about this. So you need a ruler who's powerful enough to actually enforce the rules, which is necessary, Hobbes says, because a person may wish to act wrongly for their self-interest while everyone else follows the rules, right? But that, you need to prevent that. So you need a state powerful enough that individuals never feel it's in their self-interest to kind of cheat the system. So, as I've said, right, his theory is very materialistic in the sense that it assumes no abstract ideas, no Platonic moral philosophy. There's no independent good that is objective and timeless. It assumes no theology. It doesn't assume any God, any religion, right? Nature has no morals. Nature has no God. Morality doesn't exist. The state of nature is a brutal struggle for survival. Life is just matter in motion in a particular configuration, and we're lucky enough that we're just rational enough to come and enter into this social contract to escape the state of nature and invent the technology of morality so as to allow a certain kind of collaboration in society, therefore, to occur. And this is kind of a metaphor, but if you want to understand Hobbes, think of morality as a technology. Morality isn't something we discover, it's something we invent, we refine, and it's no different than a smartphone or a car. Morality is a series of technologies, cultural technologies that are used to help human survival. But they're not independent things. Or as Hobbes says, we don't accuse man's nature. The desires and passions of man are in themselves no sin. What he's saying here is that it's normal. Of course we're going to want to be immoral. Of course we're going to want to grab other people's stuff. No more are the actions that proceed from those passions, till they know a law that forbids them, which till laws can be made they cannot know, nor can they agree on any law be made till they agree upon the person that shall make it. So there is no morality prior to the social contract. Morality is a technology, is an invention that we are rational enough to make. We discover morality just as we discovered fire and the wheel in agriculture. To this war of every man against every man, which is the state of nature, which is the state lions and gazelles are in, nothing can be unjust, because there is no justice. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, have no place until you create the social contract. Morality or right and wrong, these are qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. And a society is created by the social contract, which is what you want. And as I've said, Hobbes is really pessimistic about human nature here, right? Because he's making the claim that if we don't have these laws and enforcement, we're just going to naturally act poorly. Right? Humans, as he puts it, are offensive to one another. We are insatiable. We want more. We want more stuff. No matter how much we have, we want more. We're vain to the point of pride and madness, right? Especially the idea of human pride and the fact that we are insatiable creatures that always want more means we're never going to have a stable democracy. So he's textbook authoritarian here. However, despite these problems intrinsic to human nature, that we're fundamentally bad creatures, um, there's two things that play in our favor. As I've said, our reason. We're rational enough to know that the social contract is a good deal. The social contract is a great deal. And we can also play on the fact that we have a natural fear of death. So if you play on reason and the fear of death, you can use these things to overcome the problems of our natural offensiveness to one another. You can use these non-moral traits, rationality and our survival instinct or fear of death, to create morality, to create the technology of morality. It's because we're egotistical and selfish that our fear of death motivates us to join the social contract. For Hobbes, the real problems we should fear is irrationality. Anyone who lacks the fear of death, for Hobbes, is not going to be able to enter the social contract and is going to cause a problem. Which is why, again, for Hobbes, the government authority has to be absolute, especially in terms of being able to get people to fear their own death at its hands so that they cooperate, they join the social contract, they agree to be moral, they agree to put their nature in check because their fear of death is greater than their desire to act immorally and get things out of it. Let me just skip a few slides here. Let me talk about this concept of the social contract in relation to the prisoner's dilemma. Am I still online? We are good. We're at 23 minutes. I just wanted to check that really quickly. So, in the state of nature, we can't really cooperate. We can't cooperate because we don't know whether people are going to be screwing us over, roughly. So the prisoner's dilemma is kind of a classic problem of rational decision-making in game theory. It goes a little bit like this. It's a classic we call it the prisoner's dilemma because it's a classic police interrogation technique, where say you have two criminals, and you interrogate them separately. And what you really need is to get a confession out of them, Brooklyn Nine-Nine style. You need them to confess. So what you want to do is you take them apart and you both say, look, we have enough evidence to get you, all right? We can go to, we have enough evidence to get you, all right? But tell you what, you rat out your partner and tell us where the jewels are hidden, you can go free. Your partner's going to get 20 years. I mean, he probably forced you into it, right? You were probably coerced. I mean, he sweet-talked you into we'll get a plea bargain deal, you'll go free, right? Just rat on your partner. He'll get 20 years, you'll go free. So, but both parties, both of the alleged criminals in this scenario are told the same thing. So what this grid kind of means that both individuals have two options, so there's 4 total outcomes, right? So on this scenario, they can choose to confess or not confess. They can choose to rat out their partner or not rat out their partner. So suppose neither of them rats on each other. The police are going to send them to jail for 6 months each on a lesser charge. If, however, say green prisoner doesn't rat out his partner and blue prisoner does, blue prisoner goes free, the other one gets 20 years. And you say, that sucks. And vice versa. All right, green rats out blue, green goes free, blue goes for 20 years. Over here, if they rat out each other, on this scenario, suppose they just get 8 years for ratting out each other. So that's the outcome. The story, forget the story for a second, just think of the numbers here, right? Right, 0 is better than 6, 6 is better than 8 years, right? 6 months is better than 8 years, 8 years is better than 20 years. So what you want to avoid is 20 years, And what you want is to have 0 prison time. You just want to go free. But how do you get to the best outcome? The best collective outcome is 6 months plus 6 months, right? 1 year, right? This is 16 years, 20 years, 20 years, 12 months. So the best collective outcome for both parties is down here, the 12-month outcome, where they both cooperate. What does cooperate mean? Roughly, it means they don't rat each other out. However, if they don't rat each other out and they have this agreement, Green can think to himself, wait a minute, he's not going to rat me out. If I rat him out, I can go free, and instead of 6 months, I'll get 0, and he'll get 20 years. So it's a suboptimal outcome in terms of both of them. The collective outcome is bad, but the individual outcome is good. Right? The best collective outcome is here, right? Both cooperate. But the best individual outcome for this character here is to go free, and the other guy gets 20 years. And again, forget about prisoners, forget about cops. Any situation where, right, the incentives to cooperate create a common good, but an individual disincentive to cooperate create a dilemma whereby it could make more sense to screw the other guy over. But if both are thinking this, right, you're going to end up defect over here, and you're going to get, rationally speaking, they're going to end up here because both are thinking the same thing. Okay, so the prisoner's dilemma is this really abstract problem. I apologize if I was confusing you trying to explain it, but it has to do with the idea that to get a collaborative outcome, you need some kind of enforcement because it's in each character's rational self-interest to cheat the other one. But if they both do it, then both get in trouble. All right, so how do you get out of the prisoner's dilemma? Well, that's why you need the sovereign. When there's a power set up to constrain those that would otherwise violate their faith, for fear that fear of defection is no more reasonable. For that cause, he which by the covenants to perform first is obliged to do so. In other words, all that means is from the Leviathan, right? How do you make sure people won't back out of their contracts, right? You need someone to enforce it, right? To prevent the prisoner's dilemma, where cooperation breaks down, because it's in everybody's rational self-interest. Because if you do collaborate, the other guy might screw you over. So it's in nobody's interest to collaborate, and society breaks down. You need a sovereign. You need coercive power. Okay. Hobbes, deterministic man, self-interest. So let me turn to Locke here, because I just want to give you kind of the big idea of the state of nature. So the big ideas for Hobbes are, of course, state of nature is brutal. There's no such thing as morality. Morality is a kind of technology we can invent using our reason, and we need that morality to take the form of a sovereign capable of enforcing contracts, and that capacity to enforce contracts must be really strong, because authority has to be strong, because we only fear death. If we're not sufficiently scared of the sovereign power, we're just going to go back to our old ways of screwing everyone over. Okay, that's kind of roughly it. So let's turn to John Locke, our other social contract theorist. So, I mean, Locke is an influential philosopher, not just for social contract theory, he's also a very significant empiricist. I mean, neither Hobbes or Locke were exactly rationalists, obviously, but Locke probably made more contributions to empiricism, and he was also a social contract theorist. So Locke wrote, I mean, his two big books, one of his books, his Statement of Empiricism, which is the inquiry concerning human understanding, and his book on political philosophy is the Two Treaties. A lot of Locke's views on political philosophy was enshrined in the American Constitution. There's a lot of overlap there. The Founding Fathers clearly were familiar with Locke. So let's go over his theory of ideas pretty quickly before we go back to Locke's distinct conception of the social contract. There's a link here. So Descartes was a rationalist, right? Which means that he thinks knowledge derives from reason alone, foundationally at the heart of reason, of knowledge is reason, right? For Descartes, that was because of his methodological skepticism. We discard everything that can be doubted. What we are left with is a purely rational truth, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Locke, none of that. He's an empiricist. All knowledge of the world comes from what the senses tell us. It's a complex process. From our senses, we acquire simple, basic ideas like shapes, tastes, right? Just like really basic sensory input. Red. Oh, this is round. These things directly correlate to our self-perception, and they become the building blocks of more complex ideas, right? This gives us, like, for example, like some ideas are obvious complexes, like you can break them down, right? What is a unicorn? A unicorn doesn't really exist. It's an idea. It's an idea of horse with an idea of being horned, and these are things we kind of experience. Of course, we don't experience horse. We experience like brown, animal, large, right? And then we have a theory of mental combination, which combines these symbols into more complex ideas. This is a really important theory for later cognitive scientists, right? How does the brain work? The brain takes small basic units and configures them into larger, more complex units. And it's an important theory of how the mind works. And Locke, the empiricist, of course, will criticize Descartes in a similar way Aristotle criticized Plato before, this old empiricist rationalist argument here. Right? Any ideas we reflect on must have come from our senses. So reason can only operate on experience. Reason alone has nothing to work with. Descartes can't have an innate idea of a perfect being. You need experiences in the world before you can build up the idea of perfection or being, because the idea of perfection is a complex concept built up from simple concepts, which are themselves direct correlates of sensory experience. All thoughts are constructs of simple sense experience. All our ideas are derived from something we've experienced. Prior to experience, our minds are a complete blank slate, says Locke. So Descartes can't possibly be right. Sense perception is the foundation of knowledge because all the ideas we work with reason are derived from experience. So, reason is not foundational, observation is for Locke. Okay, so that's his view of empiricism, roughly, quickly. But Locke is perhaps better known today, even though he's one of the key empiricists of that period, he's probably better known today as a political philosopher. So in book one of the two treaties, right, there's two treaties of government. In the first one, he argues against the divine right of kings. In the second treatise, he argues that democratic government is not just good, but is justified in a specific way as a social contract between equal individuals. In it, he also articulates how this democracy should work, right? The idea of the separation of powers, what is a legitimate exercise of authority, when illegitimate power could be deposed. So it's actually one of the key foundational texts of modern secular democracy. So, as I've said, Treatise 1 attacks the view that monarchs derive their power from God's appointment of kingship. So, believe it or not, lots of European kings said, why do I get to be king? Well, God appointed kingship upon Adam, and it's passed down to generations. I'm a direct descendant, so there you go. I mean, the divine right of kings was the dominant political philosophy of for 1,000 years. So, it's hard to believe today. But of course, if you have a new idea like democracy, you have to show that the old one is bad, not sustainable, wasn't working. Right? I know divine right of kings sounds crazy to us today. So I don't have the first treatise is actually kind of funny because the first treatise really does a nice humorous job at poking holes into divine right of kings theory, and I really should have slides for it. I think I used to when I taught the class a few years ago, but for this version of the slides I kind of cut it down a little bit. But the two treatises is actually pretty readable, so if you want, just pick up a copy and have a look. So much like Hobbes, in the second treatise, Locke is going to justify social contract theory on the basis of an argument concerning the state of nature. The state of nature is the state of humans prior to any form of organized central government where there was authority, where there was an authority that could then, enforce laws and contracts. But unlike Thomas Hobbes, you know, Locke's state of nature was not awful in the sense that Locke doesn't really believe we are no better than hyenas and lions and gazelles and whatnot. We're different. The state of nature is not awful and warlike. We're not constantly looking behind our backs for someone trying to stab us. We're mostly reasonable and tolerant people, Locke says. Left alone, most human beings will just pursue a form of benign self-interest. Our self-interest is to mind our own business, cultivate our own fields, recognizing everybody's equal life to the pursuit of liberty and life. And mostly we're going to get along. We can voluntarily enter into a social contract, which is legitimate because we've consented to it. And why would we consent to it? Only when individual action is not sufficient to defend individual rights. When institutions can mediate conflict, prevent violence and war. When collective action is required to build something that an individual can't, right? Like a road, a library, a hospital, a court of law. So, again, we see very different approaches here. For Hobbes, because the state of nature is so awful, the role of government is to be really authoritarian and rule over everything. So by default, the government's in charge of everything. For Locke, it's kind of the opposite. We get along pretty well, and by default, the government is in charge of nothing except what we grant it. So it's kind of a positive versus negative conception of what of the role of government should be, in the sense that for Locke, you don't have government until you consent to it to do something you need it to do. For Hobbes, you always have government. You always have to have authority, right? Because you're always going to need it. Again, unlike Hobbes, Locke argues that humans have natural rights. Hobbes doesn't believe in any of this stuff. For Hobbes, we're just animals living in the state of nature. We invent morality. We pretend there's morality because it's in our self-interest to escape the state of nature, which is awful, and it's better to live under authoritarian rule capable of upholding the rule of law than to live in the state of nature. But there's no such thing as natural rights. What is a natural right? It's a fiction. Animals don't have natural rights. For Locke, we do. We should assume humans have a right to life, to health, to liberty, to property. These are all prior to society. Natural law is inherent to human nature. It's simply what we are. Equality is part of this, too, in the sense of we each have these equal rights. Obviously, Hobbes obviously doesn't believe in any of this. So equality here in the Lockean context doesn't mean equality of ownership. It is equality of rights. And we can also form social laws, which are different than natural laws. Natural law is prior to society. Social law is after society, right? Social laws are the basis or the outcome of the social contract, I should say. And politics is the exercise of social law for the preservation and extension of our natural rights. Of course, I could have my natural rights curtailed if I transgress the law, but it's something I consent to. Now, I can go to jail if I break the law because I've consented to this outcome, right, as a function of the social contract. So again, very big difference between Locke and Hobbes here, right? Locke believes in natural rights, thinks that government is limited in scope, and by default there is no government until we grant it. Whereas Hobbes, exactly the opposite. We have no natural rights. Everything is a social contract invention, and government by default is there. So government power is not absolute for Locke. Government power should be constructed only in the manner best to serve its intended purpose. And Locke argues for the separation of powers on this basis. So we have a legislative and executive branch. He doesn't mention the judicial branch directly, but right later on this was added by the founding fathers of the American constitutional system. It's there's kind of an English common law tradition here anyway. The history is really complex. Is the point. Um, Locke, I mean, he's a pretty interesting thinker. Um, he argues that unused property is a crime against all. So if there's like a if so this is like if there's a wealthy landowner in Britain who's not cultivating their land, and there's people who are hungry that could use the food that could have been grown on that land, then the wealthy landowner is doing something wrong. Um, and he definitely argues that inequality is bad. And part of the function of government is to address certain kinds of inequality that can lead to political unrest. So Locke, really interesting guy here. And as I mentioned earlier, both Locke and Hobbes are really tremendously influenced by the discovery, in scare quotes, of North America and the peoples already living there. And it was influenced in a couple different ways. One of them was it definitely influenced his empiricism, his tabula rasa view, which is that we start as a blank slate. We don't have any innate ideas. All our knowledge comes from sense experience. One of the basic rationalist arguments was that we must all have an innate idea of God. But as Locke argues, if there are people in the world who do not have an innate idea of God, how could there be any innate ideas at all? Because isn't God the most basic one you could possibly have? This has to do with theological debates about something called the sensus divinatis, the divine sense, that everybody's supposed to have an inherent sense of God existing just by viewing his creation, which in turn was an argument saying there could be no honest atheists. All atheists are liars, that we all have an innate sense of God, and anybody who's telling you they don't is a liar, because we all have an innate idea of God. You don't have to be taught it. So for Locke, if you discover entire civilizations of people who don't have this innate idea of the same one they have of God, then how could there be any innate ideas at all? Everybody's living radically different lives, radically different social arrangements, right? So obviously, if we started with the same ideas, there'd be more similarity across all the different kinds of people that live on Earth. But the wide panoply and diversity of human society, civilization, philosophy, and ideas show that empiricism has to be right. So that was an interesting way. Another more unfortunate way it influenced his views, both for Locke and Hobbes, was that other societies were kind of viewed as primitive by Europeans. So it was kind of assumed that the inhabitants of the New World were living in the state of nature, at one with nature, that they didn't have private property, that there was no government, and all this stuff wasn't true, right? Part of this stuff was constructed to justify English occupation of North America, right? Locke was deeply involved in colonial affairs, in colonial governance, and politics, right? So yeah, it was nice to say wealthy British landowners are wasting land if they don't cultivate it, but the flip side of that is that the uncultivated land of North America was also ripe for colonization by the virtuous English people, and that was kind of shitty, right? That was kind of bad. Um, so, uh, so there's this kind of natural argument coming out of Locke that the vast wilderness of the New World could be owned by European settlers who would finally do something useful with the land, which is again a really kind of a really mistaken view of what the peoples who already were inhabiting North America were doing with it, because right, it's obviously just not true. Right, in terms, just to take agriculture as an example, right, for the Iroquois had really sophisticated agricultural practices, right? So I don't like Locke's theory of property, and I have my problems with some of the assumptions baked into the view that unused land has to be used up. It does a nature of its own intrinsic value, but it's also just not true. And so was Locke a colonial thinker? Yeah, yes. But land rights in the America were not secured only by political philosophy. It was a combination of treaties, trades, purchases, broken treaties, wars of conquest, de facto kind of illegal settlements, outright genocide. So did Locke have an influence on colonial practices by arguing that unused land should be used, that property is a function of mixing your labor with it? Maybe yes, maybe no. Um, I have some links here that you can kind of read about if you're interested in the question here, because you can't separate out the early modern / modern period of philosophy, roughly 16th, 17th, 18th century, from everything that was happening in the world at the time, including really crucially colonialism. Okay, let me move on to Spinoza, because at this point I am talking way too much. I'm at 46 minutes here. Um, So as the Enlightenment progressed, you had an increasing radicalization of views here. We have an increasing secularization. We have more anti-clerical sentiment. We have more people breaking with the church. Um, and we have more people arguing for views that if not were outright atheistic, were at least less theistic. So for many Enlightenment thinkers, God became the God of Deism, which is an impersonal, non-interventionist deity responsible for creating the world, who could be discovered through reason and argument and is responsible for natural laws, but doesn't interfere. Um, and one of the kind of really best examples of deism is Spinoza. And I'm just going to close on this because there's a lot of content in these slides and I've talked too much already. So Spinoza was a heretic in his time, but also a very important philosopher. He was excommunicated from his synagogue. He argued that religious texts should be approached critically as products of their time, and more controversially even, he argued that God is not separate from creation but identical to it. So, if you go back to Descartes and dualism, what you have is a problem here. You have mind and you have matter. What is the interaction between mind and matter such that our free will can make changes in the material world? It's a bit of a mystery. So for Spinoza, the solution was to reject dualism and become a monist, a specific kind of monist of which there's only one substance. What is that substance? Is neither mind nor matter, but something else, more fundamental. In this case, the more fundamental substance he identified as God. But it's a very different kind of God. Mind and matter are just one of the attributes of this fundamental deistic substance. Right? In particular, his identification of God with the natural universe meant that God would be identical with his creation. So his argument was pretty interesting, and you should have a look at it. But roughly speaking, because I'm just running out of time here, pantheism is the identification of God not just with creation, but that all things that could exist. He's very much a rationalist, right? We proceed from what is certain, and we use deductive reasoning to move from truth to truth. And yeah, so Spinoza says whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. So it's a monistic solution to the problem of dualism. There's only one substance. That substance is God, and we are just experiencing different attributes of that one fundamental substance. So have a look at these slides here. I think it's a pretty interesting, he's a pretty interesting thinker, but I really wanted to focus on Hobbes and Locke here. So thanks for watching, and I had some internet trouble, so hopefully things will work better next week.